basically, they're 3x3 posts put into the back of a pickup truck, has like a post holes for like racks to go on. Basically just built a frame with 3x3 posts and then screwed the gaggies onto the top of that, and then strapped that down to the front of the truck so that the wind resistance wouldn't snap off those 3x3s. So it worked pretty well. I've done that with a rental wheel truck as well, and those post holes are pretty universal, so you can kind of put it on any kind of truck. You might have to change the width of the top bar, but it's basically a top bar on posts. Any questions? Great. Thank you.
I saw James is using the mouse. Do you want a clicker? We have a clicker. Okay. Do you want it? If you don't mind. Yeah, I'm gonna set him up right now with it. Cheers.
All right, that brings us to the end of our first session about stewardship. Thank you so much to our presenters. We're just going to get prepared for our second session. It should continue. All right, so our next session is going to be about serving tools, and we're going to start out with the top from Morningstar, looking at techniques for tracking bats.
Okay, so let me just make sure this. Okay, so there was already some questions about telemetry. So I thought, instead of necessarily presenting a project, I'd talk about a technique, which of course is tracking bats. We've been hearing lots about it on some other projects, and this will overlap with a lot of those projects. So I thought I'd just talk about the technique and see kind of what can we do to track bats. So the first question. Okay. The first question that we have to ask if we're going to trap bats, first of all, is why? We don't trap bats just for fun. We need to have a reason, right? Why are we going to catch bats? Why are we going to put things on them and chase them around everywhere? And the biggest reason that everybody tracks bats, the number one reason, and there's others, of course, is this was not going there. Okay, there we go. Roosts. This is first. Of course, we want to find out where they're roosting, first of all, right? And that's for a lot of reasons, right? We want to find the maternity roosts, of course, where it's mothers and pups. And we want to also find day roosts, because when we're tracking them and we know the bat's up there, we don't necessarily know, other than the bat we caught, if it's a maternity roost. But a day roost would be any other part of the year, not necessarily pups. We might be able to find night roosts, that's a resting roost in the night, but you got to really be passionate because then you're tracking the night. And sometimes we can collect that together and find roosting areas, because as most of us know, they switch roosts quite frequently, so we can cluster that and figure out where the bats are roosting. Of course, the next question we want to know is, where are they swarming or hibernating? That gets a little harder, because we can find swarming sites, usually where there's a lot of bats congregating in August and September, and we want to know, are they staying there? So you can continue to monitor that location and say, were they swarming? Was that their hibernation site? Because one common misconception is that they're the same thing, and they're not. There are lots of places that bats swarm, but they don't hibernate. Probably where they hibernate, they might swarm there, we think. But there's also lots of places that they move along the landscape and they group together and do swarming where they're not going to stay for the winter. And then what they're really doing, usually when you catch bats when they're swarming in August and September, sometimes they might roost for the day in that cave, but quite often they're not. They're still roosting in a tree nearby or a building nearby using similar types of roosts that we know of in the summer. So there is a connection between the landscape and the hibernation site at that time. And then we can get a little bit more complicated with tracking if we really want to get into the more research type things and look at movement. So this this is where we're getting, we're trying to find where they're moving through that night, right? If they're feeding in certain areas, if they're using commuting areas, if they're migrating. So this is a mess of modus tracks of one species that I put up there. We've got some really interesting stuff long distance, looking at migration patterns and where they're going in the summer in different parts. And you can get really complicated and look at social studies. Are they moving together? You know, and is there anything, when you find them, are they moving among roosts, you know, in a small scale together, that sort of thing. Those are a lot more in depth, but you still have to catch the bat and track it to do that. So, so from a permitting perspective, why isn't habitat assessment and acoustics enough? That's a question that probably most consultants here are asking. And the fact is that often it will be with acoustics and habitat assessment. For many sites, you'll be able to say things about it, but then sometimes you'll just be like, there's probably habitat here. There's a bunch of trees, there's a bunch of leaves, there's a bunch of all these things that we don't know if bats are using it. And in the acoustics, you're probably going to record endangered bats almost everywhere. Like, throw a dart at Ontario, you will probably record endangered bats. But where are they going? They're just using the airspace. When you record them, where are they actually roosting? That's what you need to know on the most important sites. So we were going to be at Wisconsin, so I used the Wisconsin map here, some of the work that we did there. So here, this is an example of it. Why isn't acoustics enough? You've got this huge landscape. Almost the whole thing's forested. There's rock crevices everywhere. Where are the bats roosting in there? And we tracked several bats there. But you look at the forest, you think, where's the bat roosting? Does anybody see a bat there? There's actually a mismatch, not a bat. But still, the way we find those roosts, of course, is to track them. And so there's some pictures of one of the community nights where we caught bats and we tracked them at Wisconsin. The other thing interesting at Wisconsin is not only is there the large First Nations area here, but just north of it is Kilbear Provincial Park, where there's a whole bunch of bat boxes loaded with bats, and we caught them there too. And then south of it is Massasauga Provincial Park. And I don't know what bats are there, but I suspect there's a lot. So it's a huge landscape. How are we going to know where they're going? Okay, so when do we catch bats to track? The seasons do matter. It's not just any time when they're out in summer. So in the spring, generally, if you want to do migration, that's April. That's a tough time. Nets, usually you're setting up huge nets, as big as you can get. I usually use 18-meter triple high, massive wall of nets, and put it across a road, or a corridor, or a wetland, forest edges, things like that. So you're trying to guess during the day where the bats are going to be flying. That can be challenging. So we put up a lot of big nets. Sometimes we're across creeks, so we have to get them on canoes and things like that. Get really, really creative. And often have to build and invent whole new hard traps and netting arrangements. So it can be complicated to catch the bats, but once you finally catch the bats, then you can start putting equipment on it. I'll show pictures of that in a minute. But tracking bats, I'm going to zoom out a little bit more now. There's lots of different ways to track bats. So, of course, banding, hit tags, and mark and capture is actually a way of tracking, because you get an animal in more than one time and location. But that's not really the tracking we're talking about. We're trying to find those. A lot of people do hit tagging, mostly in academic studies. That can track movement patterns at roosting areas, but they're small readers, and you can get a long period of time because the hit tags last the life of the bat, but you have to have very focused readers. It doesn't really work to find the roost unless you know where it is. So then we go on to some more complicated stuff. So Argos is satellite, and something called Icarus is a satellite system for tags. Icarus is not currently operational because it's based on the International Space Station on the Russian part of it. So since there's been a war, that has not been accessible, so those don't work right now. And Argos is just too big for bats so far. Then you can get GPS tags. So there's a difference here. I put in brackets how we name these things, right? So a tag is anything that you stick to the animal. I have a tag in my shirt that tells me how to wash it. So a tag is anything you stick to it. But then you have transponders, which are hit tags. Transponders have a code that's red, but they don't send anything. And you have transmitters. So radio transmitters send a location of a beacon, and you have loggers. So GPS is a logger. It just stores information, and then you have to download it later. And that's the challenge with GPS tags. People are using them on some bats, but you have to recapture that bat. It's hard enough to catch the bat in the first place. So catch it again, and you put tons of these tags on so you can catch one or two. It's tough. Air tags is a brand new kind of thing that people are experimenting with. I'm starting to test air tags. That's going to be cool, but nothing to talk about yet. And there's also another tag that's on the Internet of Things platform, and that's only in Europe. It's called Sigfox, and it's a mesh. Apparently it works really well, just like our Modus system here, but it's not available in Canada yet. So we're using VHF radio tracking tags. And this has been around for a long time. People have used VHF radio tracking tags since the 60s, and on bats for decades.
Derek, what time is the partial solar eclipse on Sunday?
So there's two different kinds of radio transmitters that we can use. One of them is beeper tags, so that's the kind of the more traditional ones. And those send out a sound, send a beep at a very specific frequency. So when you're using beeper tags, your receiver is tuned to that one frequency of one tag, and you want to get the next tag, you have to change the frequency of your receiver. So if you have 6 tags, then you're scanning through 6 different frequencies, and scanners can do that automatically, but while you're scanning for one frequency, you're not scanning for the other 5. So if you're driving down the road, 1/6 of the time if you're tracking 6 bats direction, right? So you get my math there. So beeper tags are sort of challenging that. They're a little bit cheaper, and they actually sometimes have a stronger burst signal, so you can pick it up a little further. But most of us move to digitally coded tags now. So those are the ones on low tech. They're all on one frequency, and instead of just sending a sound, they send a sound that's encoded with identification information, and then you know which tag it is. And you can put hundreds of in the same area. That's why Modus was designed. All searching on the same frequency, and for Modus here it's 166.380, and then you can really get creative, because now you have a way to do digital searching. You can use drones, and of course, as I mentioned, the Modus system, which we've all talked about. I'm going to tell more about that soon. So there's lots of other considerations when you're deciding what equipment you're going to use. There's a couple different receivers that work. For digitally coded, there's only 2 receivers that work, which is Aries and the SRX 1200. And then there's sensor domes that are on Modus, but those are the only handheld ones that I know of. And you have to think, like, how long is your transmitter going to last? How much effort is going to be to find it? How much towers do you have to put up in the air? Are there any existing Modus towers? Do you need to add them? Like Stephen was talking about. These are all things you got to think of, because they all cost money and they all cost time. Oh boy, okay. Well, I'm going to get to the fun stuff. All right, so we're going to trap the bats, and we glue the transmitter on the back. Some pictures of catching bats, and of course my daughter helping me. I was as Stephen mentioned, we catch lots of bats with the transmitters on all 8 species in Ontario. And so, there we go. One thing I'll say when you get out radio tracking, test your equipment. I'm going to say this again, test your equipment. And I mean all of it, right? So you'll be out there waving your antenna around for the whole day, and you won't know that inside the coax cable there's a break, and you weren't actually scanning anything the whole day. And you don't know that until you've tested it, right? So you need to test it on something, and you need to test it often. And as Stephen said, sometimes these Modus towers, you think they're recording, and they're not. And so there are signal analyzers for antennas that you can use to say how well is that antenna working and how well is that cable working. And you can also turn one of your transmitters on and have somebody walk away, or fly on a drone that way or something like that, so you know how far it is. Are you picking it up? How far away are you picking it up from? So that's the manual tracking, walking around, trying to find them on land, and as we mentioned before, you can get creative searching from all kinds of different vehicles. So I think there's like 8 or 9 different vehicle mounts that we've got figured out. One thing we learned with the 2 antennas is they can interfere with each other. So if they put too close to each other, you don't actually know, but they're canceling each other out. And then you're not actually scanning anything. And you won't know that until you've tested it. Right? So the configuration on top of the roof matters. We had one where we didn't have the mount stuff, but we had extra antennas, so we like stuck it on the roof racks of the minivan, and it wasn't picking anything up. And we knew that because we tested it against the handheld one. Why are you picking up the handheld and not the roof? So you should test all those things. You can get in your paddle boats and get on the boat and drive around, try to find them. It's a lot of fun. And we set up towers. So I've set up a dozen or so towers. One of them is in Belize, and lots in Ontario. That's a pretty big operation to get those set up. It takes a day-ish, but you got to find the right spot. You got to buy the right equipment. It's about $5,000 of equipment to set these up, and then there is maintenance. Again, sometimes they lose power. We've got one that is plugged in outside. Somebody keeps unplugging it. We don't know who, but it just keeps getting unplugged, and we don't know that for a month or 2. And it's like, oh, well, it was never recorded. We should probably fix that. And so as Stephen mentioned, like, so you can get to the portable ones, right? So this is what's called a portable Modus station. It's got 3 antennas on it. Still the same as a regular tower, just not as high. And then what I have is the mini Modus stations. There's little antennas here, so those are portable, automated ones that I can set up in 10 minutes. So what we get when we track is you can find roost locations. I wish I had my pointer, but I'm here to, you can hopefully see that there's a star in the middle there. And this sort of shows my detection range when I have rooftop antennas, about 500 meters on either side, and we drive through the road, so that's about where I can scan, and I found all those other roosts. This is about 10 years ago, but you can find different roosts and learn the roost network. Where is that colony of bats moving around to? And then I can show some nice and fun pictures. We're doing this in Costa Rica and Belize, so this is one of my favorite bats. It says Shirley Senex. The most beautiful bat, obviously, you can see, right? Where's the bat? Do you see the bat in the tree? No. But it was pinging like crazy. So this picture in the middle, the bat was pretty much we think. We couldn't physically see it, but it had a really strong signal, and it took us hours to find that location. And the other one was way up high. And we couldn't get up there because there was a waterfall and a cliff, and we couldn't climb it. This was, of course, in mountains of Costa Rica. So sometimes you get as close as you can, and you try as hard as you can to pinpoint those locations, and you really try hard, but you have issues with land access, with private property you can't go on, climbing cliffs that you probably shouldn't climb. So sometimes you just get as close as you can, and that's about all you have. And we get some interesting data like this. So this is a mini motor station at Sagamok that we had set up, and we didn't realize that it was right beside the roost. It was actually mounted on the roost, on the building. So the one, it's hard to tell, but the blue circles at the top, that's every day that back was picked up from that little mini motor station that was there, and it was turned off for a day. And then there's 3 other bats that are there, or 4 other bats. 1, 2, 3, 4. 3 other bats. So some of them kind of showed up fairly often. 3 of them are little browns, one's a silver-haired, and it was flying past ours every day. And then one of them is a little brown from another First Nation at Wanapate First Nation, 140 kilometers away. That we picked up on this one, which was really cool. And then you can look at the time scale. So this other thing is a time scale, and it's offset by 4 hours. So what this shows is that the bat was leaving at night to go feed at the beginning, and then it was coming back during the day, and it's always there during the day, and then it decided it would just feed right there. It seems like it was never outside of the detection zone, but it was still alive and moving, because you see some gas leaving. So here's another time spectrum, and this one's cool too. So this is the hoary bat that Stephen was talking about. Actual one got picked up on the tower that you can see in the parking lot right there, and went out towards the lake. And it did that every day. So there's 2 towers being picked up on. We have a tower at the lake where we caught it, and then we have this tower. And you can see from the time spectrum, it would fly by one tower every night, fly by that one tower, feed in the area, and actually in this case it's during the day. So it would fly over to its roost, picked up all day its roost, and it would leave, and you can tell it was going back there because it got picked up on 2 towers. And then we come back every day for almost 2 weeks. So we can get notice tracks. So this one is from Moose Deer Point. And these little browns, in this case, all seem to go to the same area down, Go Home Bay area. So that's an area where Adam's working, Georgia Bay Land Trust, I think, and trying to find stuff there. We're like, find this cave! Stephen and I even flew from a plane to try and find a cave. We still haven't found a hibernation site there, so if anybody knows, let us know. But lots of bats seem to go that way in the fall, like in September, early September. And then we can get some long-distance tracks. So this is a silver-haired bat that started up, in this case, at a Tecumseh. It flew down to Lake Ontario and then went across southern Ontario and down towards Point Pelee there. So it's a pretty interesting track. And this is one of the craziest ones I've seen. So this hoary bat, I think it's got a couple of false detections. Sometimes our bats show up in BC and in Guatemala. That's not true. That's a false detection. I'm not sure if it stopped in Ottawa. I see Christina. Maybe it did, maybe it didn't. But it kind of went straight down Ontario, and then went back and forth between Toronto and Hamilton for like 5 days. And basically, I think we were seeing the Toronto Zoo, and maybe then going to McMaster, and then it went way down to St. Louis eventually. It stopped at a few other towns. Pretty cool stuff. And here's a piece of redback, also went down to the southwest. I'm about to get kicked off. And that's it. Thank you.